Hi there, and welcome to another episode of Growing Together. I'm Randy Potter, and in this show, you and I can have fun learning and experimenting with the fundamental concepts of gardening and grow together. So last episode, we learned about planting tomatoes and peppers in containers, and it's been a few weeks since we planted them, so we're going to check out how they're doing. As you can see, we've got some serious growth, which is very exciting, and most exciting of all, we've actually got some tomatoes starting to fruit. Now, you'll notice I actually added something else to my tomato planters, which is this down here. And what these are nasturtiums. We'll talk about those in a minute. But first, let's focus on our tomatoes. Now, if you'll recall, I focused on setting myself up for success by using a good medium to grow my tomatoes, which was very rich in organic material and allowed for proper drainage. I added some fertilizer and I added a layer of compost over the top, again, to add that organic material and help regulate my moisture. And by doing those things, I've done myself a favor because I've really not had to touch these at all. It's been several weeks and it's been a fairly rainy summer, so I haven't had to water too much. In fact, I've really only watered these once, and I attribute that to using such a good medium for my plants. Now, as you can see, that's also contributed to some serious growth here, but what we're going to talk about is how you continue to maintain those plants. So, one of the things that I think is one of the most often overlooked aspects of gardening is pruning. Now, you don't want to prune vegetables too much. You're not going to be shaping them and cutting them back significantly, but there are a few things you can do to help focus on positive and productive growth so that you get lots of big, hearty tomatoes, because that's the whole point. And if you look closely at your tomato plant, you're going to see the joints of where those branches branch out from the main stems. And a lot of times, you'll have one branch sticking out, and then another one pops out right at that juncture. And that's called a sucker. And that's called a sucker because what it does is it actually will suck away nutrients and lights and things like that from your plant and kind of detract from its overall growth. So what we want to do is cut them off. So right at that joint, you'll notice a main branch sticking off of our main stem here, and this other one sticking out right in that joint there. And what's going to happen is this guy's not ever really going to grow tomatoes. It's going to add on size, and like I said, the plant's going to be putting its energy into growing that, but it's not really going to help it put out tomatoes. So what we're going to do is right at that juncture, I'm just going to carefully snip that right off like that, and there you go. And what that'll do is allow that plant to focus its energy on those main stems, again, creating more productive fruiting. So just go down your stem here and there, cut them off. They're not big or anything, you know, it's not a lot of work, but it's one of those little things that can really help your tomatoes be that much more productive, and it'll be great for your plants. Now we'll talk about our nasturtiums down here. So what I've done is a bit of companion planting by planting two things in the same pot that I think can work together. The reasons I chose nasturtiums are they're an herb that a lot of deer and rabbits don't particularly like, so I thought that might help kind of keep some pesky pests away from nibbling on my tomatoes. And another reason I like nasturtiums a lot is that I think they're really fun plant to grow. They're cool. I like their leaves, and they add a little bit of color to your tomato plants. They got these really cool flowers, and what's nice about the flowers is not only are they pretty, they're edible. So you can pop them on a salad or put them as like a little garnish on your plates, and you can eat them. And they actually have kind of a nice spicy, flavorful taste, so they're a nice addition, and they'll really impress your dinner guests if you try that out. Now, in addition to our tomatoes, if you'll recall, we actually also planted some peppers, and as you can see, those are doing quite well as well, largely because, again, of the medium we used and the things we did to set ourselves up for success. And we've got lots of growth, we've got some flowers on these ones, and we even have some peppers ready to go on these ones. So these are a little bit of an early one. Still waiting on some peppers from some other plants, but there you go, a nice beautiful pepper that's ready to go. You could eat it right off the plant. I like to pickle mine. They're great for stuffed peppers. But again, the reason that I have this and that I haven't had to do much to my plants is because I really set myself up for success. So we're going to talk about some of that as well as some other gardening fundamentals today in regards to perennials. It's kind of late in the summer, but there's still a lot of gardening to be had, particularly with perennials. So we're going to talk about what exactly perennials are, things to consider when you're growing them, and how to make your garden look that much better. So come on with me, we'll have fun growing together and learning all about perennials. So as I was saying, there's a lot of things you can do proactively to help out your plants in terms of disease prevention, pest control, overall health of the plant, fertilization, and we'll get into all that throughout the show. But first, let's start with the basics. Like, what is a perennial? Most plants fall into two categories, perennials and annuals, and a lot of times people have a hard time remembering which is which. Perennials are plants that in your area are going to survive the winters. So oftentimes they'll grow in the spring, bloom in the summer, then in the fall they'll start to die back and kind of hibernate underground throughout the winter, and then come next spring when the weather breaks, start to regrow from their roots. Annuals, on the other hand, are plants that won't survive the winter. Now the trade-off is that most annuals are going to bloom all summer long, like a petunia or a geranium. You plant them in your container and they're just going to pump out blooms all summer. But like I said, when winter comes and that plant dies back, it's going to die. Its life cycle is over. It's not going to regrow from the ground. A perennial, which will regrow from the ground, is going to have more of a limited bloom time. It's kind of the trade-off that nature seems to have presented us with. So that's something to consider when planting. Blooms are probably the #1 factor that people think about when they're picking their plants for their garden, which makes sense. Flowers are very exciting. I think they're one of the most amazing things in the world. The fact that nature has evolved this thing to attract other animals and bugs to it. It's kind of like nature's competition of which is the most beautiful or tasty, and you get some really amazing things. But there's other factors to consider when growing perennials too. Now, as I said, where you are is going to depend on what's a perennial or not. We're in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and we're right on the border of what's called Zone 5 or 6. So the USDA has split the country up into different zones. And the lower the number a plant is certified to means the lower the temperature that plant can survive. So I said, we're in Zone 5 or 6. We're right on the border. If you're north of Pittsburgh, you're probably Zone 5. If you're south of Pittsburgh, you're probably Zone 6. And as the world changes, those zones do fluctuate a little bit. But what you're going to look for whenever you're picking your plant is a zone listing on a tag. So if that plant is listed to Zone 4, for example, not only is it going to be hardy here, survive the winters, it's going to be hardy even a little bit more north into Zone 4. Now, if that plant is listed at a Zone 8, for example, it's not going to be a perennial here. It's not going to survive the cold temperatures. But if you're in South Carolina, for example, it might be a perennial there. So you'll see a lot of plants in Florida and in southern US and different parts of the world that grow year-round that we can't grow here year-round. But again, that's just the trade-off of the things that we're looking for. So keep that in mind when choosing your perennials. As I said, the other main factor that people think about when they're choosing perennials is blooms. But there are other things to consider too. As I said, perennial bloom times are going to be kind of a limited window. So you're only going to have, a few weeks to work with your blooms. That's going to vary from plant to plant. Some, like lavender, are going to bloom very long time, from 4 to 8 weeks. Others, like an Asiatic lily, have beautiful blooms, but they're usually only around for a week or two. So that's why I like to consider other factors like the size of the plant, the growth habit, is it going to spread? Is it going to grow tall? Does it vine? The texture, do you have big broadleaves? Are you mixing those with feathery things? Those are all things to consider whenever you're picking your perennials. So we're going to talk about, like I said, some maintenance. We're going to talk about planting, disease prevention, all these things to consider. But one of the most common questions we get is, when can I plant? And the great thing about perennials is that you can pretty much plant all season long. The best times are probably spring and fall. I prefer to plant in fall because what you do is, if you can plant in fall early enough that your plant's gonna still have some time to put out some roots before the winter hits. And what happens is, when winter comes and that plant dies back, again, it's still living underground, it's still growing and alive and establishing itself, so that when spring comes, right when that plant's ready to break up, it goes into full-on grow mode. It's trying to do all it can to put out its energy and grow as much as it can while that spring and summertime are bringing in that good sunshine and weather. So if you have your plant in the ground already, it's kind of got a head start and it can hit the ground running, so to speak. But again, spring is the next best time to plant. Get that plant in early and it's going to have all summer and all season long to keep on growing. But if it's the middle of summer like it is right now, still a great time to plant. Again, you can plant all the way through fall. Really, up until the ground is frozen, you can plant perennials. So, like I said, right now is a great time. So if you want to come on with me, let's plant a perennial. So as I said, there's lots of different factors to consider when planting your perennials, but the two most important factors are light and water. Remember, those are two of the most vital things that plants need to grow. So you need to consider, do you get a lot of light? Do you get a lot of shade? Are you planting in a wet area, dry area? Things like that. Now, at my house, I have these wonderful big pine trees, and I get a fair amount of shade, so I typically stick to perennials that are shade tolerant. Most plants are going to do better the more sun they get. For example, a rhododendron is a shrub that a lot of people think of as a shade shrub. However, the biggest, most beautiful, and most productive rhododendrons that you see are going to be in full sun. It's really more of a case that the plant is more shade tolerant. That said, there are some plants that do prefer to be in some shade, and there are some plants that don't like any shade. So if you're having trouble deciding, the internet is a great resource, but even better than that is stopping in at your local garden center and asking the experts, because they're gonna know how things perform where, especially in your area. So as I said, I get a lot of shade, so I've picked some shade varieties to plant in my home. Now, another factor I mentioned is the bloom time, and I prefer to pick my plants based on their foliage because blooms are fleeting. I love flowers, but they're not going to be around a lot, so I like to pick plants that even when those flowers aren't there, are going to give me great focal interest. So I've planted some other things like Brunera, which have these awesome variegated leaves, and some lungwort, which both of those flower, but again, those leaves really add a lot of focal interest even when they're not in bloom. But I've got a couple more to plant here to fill in my area. So I've picked some Lamium here, also known as dead nettle. And another reason I pick these plants is because, like most people in our area, the suburbs of Pittsburgh, we're gonna have a lot of deer, and these are deer-resistant plants. Again, if you're looking for deer-resistant plants, the internet's a great resource, or even better, your local garden center. So I've got my Lamium. I'm gonna go ahead and put, a great way to kind of feel things out is, just play with the pots. You can move things around. It's a great way. You never know how things are gonna look until you see it. You might have this idea in your head, but when you lay it all out, it doesn't quite work out that way. So I've kind of arranged things here, and I think I'm gonna put this one right here. So let's go through the steps of how we do that. Now again, one of the main factors in addition to light is water. So it's good practice to check your drainage in your area. A good way to do that is dig a hole about the size you're planting and fill it with water completely. And then if you check back later in the day, a few hours later, see if that water's receded. If that hole is still full of water, you probably don't have great drainage. That's okay. It just might affect what plants you decide to plant where. If you don't have great drainage, you might want to pick a plant that does better in a wet area, like an iris or a perennial hibiscus. If you go around in our local area, around a lake, you'll probably see those growing by the shore. So those are a good bet of something that's going to grow well in our area in a wet place. Now, I'm pretty familiar with my yard, so I know my drainage is pretty okay. So I'm not going to do the drainage test. I'm just going to go ahead and plant. But again, if you're planting in a new area, that is good practice. So the first step is pretty obvious. You're going to dig a hole. Now, the most common question is, what size of a hole do you need to dig? You don't need to go overboard. You're going to dig a hole about the size of your pot. You can see that's about a 1 to 2 gallon size pot. Not crazy, so I'm not going to dig out, the Grand Canyon here or anything like that. But I am going to make it a little bit bigger so that I can add some soil amendment to help my plant. Because in Western Pennsylvania especially, you're going to get some clay soil. So now that we've got our hole pretty well dug out, we're going to go ahead and optimize our soil for growth. So if you'll recall from planting tomatoes and peppers in containers, as I said, the soil is one of the most overlooked things when people garden. They focus on the plants, which makes sense. But if you consider, other than light, that plant is getting everything it needs through the soil. So the better you can set yourself up for success, the more healthy and the more productive your plants are going to be. So I'm going to add what's called a soil builder here. This one that I prefer to use is called Bumper Crop. It's what they call, like I said, a soil builder. I like this one in particular because it's full of organic material and just has all that good stuff that your plants are going to love. And why I like to do that when I'm planting even in the ground is that, especially if you're buying plants later in the season, sometimes plants are going to become root bound. And what that means is those roots are going to be pressing up against the side of the pot. But you want those roots now to take into the ground and start spreading out. And if you give them some really good juicy soil that they're going to love, they're going to be more likely to do that. So I'm just going to open that up like a big old bag of chips. All right, and then I'm just going to go ahead and add just a little bit to the bottom. Again, I dug my hole just a little deeper and a little wider than I really need to be, but I didn't go crazy. So I'm just going to add, a few handfuls of that. Kind of get a nice bed there for my plant. So again, this is a Lamium, also known as a dead nettle. You can find these pretty much at any local garden center. I like it because it does well in shade, it blooms in the spring, and the deer don't like it. So that's something I'm considering. So I'm gonna go ahead and just gently wiggle that out of the pot, and there you can see, that's what I'm talking about, that root boundness. That's nothing to worry about. Very common in the garden center. You figure places trying to sell plants are trying to get the biggest, most beautiful plant in the smallest pot that they can. So that's very common, and it won't negatively affect the plant, but there are some things that you can maybe do just to make sure that your plant's really gonna take off. A lot of times you'll see people break these up, so I am gonna go ahead and just kind of claw at it a little bit. I'm not gonna go crazy. Sometimes I think people go a little overboard, really disrupting the roots. But plants are pretty resilient. You don't need to be too shy about it either. If you cut some of those roots off or something like that, plant's gonna regrow. And again, rather than regrowing in this kind of condensed ball, now those plants are gonna regrow into the ground. So sometimes if your plant is very root bound and you leave it as such, and you plant it in the ground, even though you've got it in the ground, those roots are gonna wanna stay very tight. And what that does, obviously, is it limits your root growth, which limit your plant, but it also makes it harder for that plant to get water, so you're gonna have to be doing a lot more work. So just a little bit like that will help you out in the future. So again, I'm not going crazy, I'm not entirely breaking it up, just a little bit so that those roots are gonna now want to grow. Same idea as when you prune the top of a plant. When you cut off that stem, it's gonna wanna regrow from there, and oftentimes when it does, rather than just one stem, you'll get two. So you're gonna get bushier kind of root growth whenever you do that. So now that I've got my roots broken up, I'm just gonna go ahead and place that into my hole. All right, it's sitting a little bit low, so all I'm gonna do for that, I might have gone a little overboard digging. That's no problem. We'll just get to add a little bit more of that super rich soil builder, build it up, and that's actually a good thing because, again, that just adds more of that great material that plant's gonna wanna grow in. All right, and then we'll set that right there to plant. So that looks pretty good, but obviously, again, I made my hole a little bit bigger than I needed to, so you'll see that area to fill in. If you're planting this at home and you don't have soil builder and you just want to use the soil you had, that's fine. But if you look at this soil in Western Pennsylvania, it's clay, it's rocky, it's okay, plants will grow. But if you look at this soil from the soil builder, you can see the difference. It's crumbly, it's nice and dark and rich, and plants are really gonna go crazy in that. So I'm just gonna go ahead and spread that all around my plant evenly so that those roots are gonna have some nice juicy material to plant into. Now the Lamium's kind of bushy. You might have to kind of hold its hair back, so to speak. But again, plants are resilient. Don't be too concerned about keeping your plant nice and pretty. It's gonna die back at the end of the year eventually anyways, so don't be too concerned with that. We're just gonna go ahead and fill up all that area around it with that good soil mixture so that our plant can take off. Because again, the things I'm mainly considering when I plant this is light and water. And what that soil does, not only does it add organic material, it's gonna help this plant regulate its moisture in both directions. It allows for some drainage so that if we get more really wet days, it's not gonna hold on to it quite as much as clay would. But it also will hold on to water well enough so that in the hot summer days, it won't bake out quite as much as clay will either. I know that's kind of counterintuitive, but that's what happens when you get a really nice soil mixture. It kind of helps regulate your plant. So there you go. I've got it pretty much built up to the plant. You don't want to go overboard. You'll see I didn't bury any of my stems or anything. I really just want to cover the roots, especially with stockier plants. People have the tendency to want to kind of build up a pyramid around those plants, or people do that with mulching. You don't want to do that. If you build up that pyramid, it's actually going to increase the chances of getting root rot, fungal diseases, because that soil is now covering a part of the plant that's meant to be above ground. So I'm not gonna go overboard, just cover those roots. I can kind of spruce my plant up there. And now I'm almost done. One final step that you should do when planting any plant, whether you're planting in the garden or in a pot, is you're gonna go ahead and water it in. Now the reason you water it in is not only obviously plants need water, but when you do that, again, it allows that kind of freshly potted roots to mix in with the soil builder and get things kind of, mixed together so that you're breaking the barrier between that root wall and the soil, and it's going to instigate that root growth that you really want. So just going to very simply soak that down with water. Now watering is one of the most common questions that people ask us about any kind of planting, and with perennials, one of the most common questions is when to water and how often. Now as far as when to water, the best time of day is, some people like to do it at the evening, and I would highly recommend that you do not water in the evening. I think the best time of day is actually in the morning time. And the reason for that is if you water it in the evening, the sun's gone down, the nighttime's gonna cool things off a bit, and that water is basically just gonna sit there. And what happens is if your plant sits in water overnight, and it does that a lot, your plant's gonna be more likely to rot. Whereas if you water it in the morning, that water soaks into the ground, then the sun comes out, and that allows that plant to actually use that water. It's gonna transpire, and that water won't be sitting there, and it's gonna greatly reduce your risk of getting fungal diseases. So we've got our plant planted in the ground. Again, we dug our hole a little bit bigger than we needed to, added some soil builder, covered up those roots, which we broke up, and then we watered it in, and then you're pretty much set to go. So there you go, you've got a perennial planted. I've got a few more to plant around the yard, and things are gonna be looking pretty great here next spring, so I'm excited to keep things going. So now that we've got our perennial planted, you probably have some questions on how do I keep maintaining this and keep it continuing to grow and thriving from there. So one of the things that I'll mention first and foremost is, again, often overlooked in gardening, is pruning. Now perennials are kind of unique in that once they're planted, they're very low maintenance, and often you don't really have to do much to them at all. And a lot of times at the end of summer, in the fall, people start to ask, what do I do with this plant now? You'll notice most perennials are starting to die back and browning, and sometimes people want to cut them back, and you can, but you don't need to. In fact, I would recommend that you let your perennials basically do what they're gonna do, because as that plant's dying back, until it has that very last bit of green, it's gonna be using that green to photosynthesize until the bitter end. So if you can stand it to just let your perennials do their thing until they're completely brown before you cut them back, that's gonna be best for the plant, because again, it's absorbing all that sunlight and it's storing that energy into its roots. So if you can allow the plant to do that, it's gonna be better set to protect itself in the winter, and then when spring comes, really take off next year. But if you've got a bunch of brown, dead-looking perennials and you really don't like the way your yard looks, it's your yard. You can go ahead and cut those back. It's very hard to kill or hurt a plant by pruning it. Again, they're pretty resilient. I think people get a little scared. It seems like an aggressive kind of thing to do to a plant. Don't be shy. It's okay. You can prune it back. Now I'm going to talk about pruning a plant in the mid-season that you might want to do, and I'll tell you why. This is a lavender. Very popular perennial, especially in the last few years, for a lot of reasons. It grows really well. It does great in full sun. Deer and rabbits and things like that don't particularly like it. It smells great. If you rub the leaves, oh, there's herbal oils on those plants that smell amazing. So it has a lot of uses. People use it for culinary things, making teas. You can make soaps. You can dry them out and just have them as like a potpourri. You can do all kinds of stuff with lavender. But you'll notice that this one's kind of looking a little bit ratty. They have a long bloom time. This one's probably been blooming for 4 to 6 weeks or so. But again, it's starting to look a little ratty. It probably needs to be planted in another pot. But what I'm gonna do is clean this plant up a bit and potentially give it a chance to bloom again. So what I'm gonna do is prune this plant back. And again, you don't need to be too cautious or careful. Some plants you might need to, double check, but most perennials, again, they're gonna die back in the winter anyway, so it's pretty hard to damage them. And I'm basically just gonna give that a haircut, just like that. And I'm just gonna kind of take my pruners, just like that. I like to use these Felco pruners, but you can use kind of any pruner you like, and I'm just gonna go ahead and give that a haircut all around and shape it and trim it nicely. Now what that's gonna do for my lavender is a couple of things. All right, so blooms take a lot of energy, and that plant was holding on to those blooms and keeping to support them as long as it can so that it can continue its next generation. But since those blooms are spent, I don't think they were looking all that great. I'm gonna go ahead and trim them back, and now rather than spending its energy on these dying blooms, this plant can re-put its energy into growing again. And now that I've cut that back, it's gonna, again, where most of the stems have been cut, it's gonna grow a couple. So it's gonna be bushy and healthy. And with the lavender, you might even have a chance to get a second bloom before summer's over. Not all perennials are like that. Like I said, most of them are gonna have one limited bloom time during which they're gonna bloom. But something like a perennial or a Russian sage or a catmint, after that first wave of blooms is starting to look a little ratty, if you cut that back, chances are by September or so, you'll have another bloom. So that's great. Again, if you wanna use them for cooking or teas, and or you just like having them in the garden, that's a great thing to do there. But again, very simple, just giving it a haircut, cleaning it up here and there, like so. And then again, if I were to plant this in the ground, now, rather than supporting those blooms, it's gonna go into growing. So lavender, as I said, is a great plant for full sun, but if you'll recall, I get a lot of shade, so it's not a plant that I would typically grow in my yard. these are all things to consider when growing. So here's a couple of perennials that I've chosen just to give you some tips and insights on what to consider whenever picking your perennials. As I said, I get a lot of shade and I have some moist areas of my yard, and I also have deer. So I'm factoring in water, light, and pests as well as aesthetics whenever I'm considering my perennials. And one of the things that fits all of those items, checks off every mark that I need it to, are ferns. Ferns are great, they grow in shade. There's a lot of native varieties in our area. The deer don't like them, and they'll do well in moist areas. And another great thing about ferns is there's tons and tons of different types. You can see the variety of the looks that you can get just with ferns. You could plant a whole bed of ferns and you can get quite a variety of textures, sizes, shapes, and colors. So that's a great example of a plant that even if it's not known for blooms, it's going to be a phenomenal perennial that's going to really take your garden to the next level. Some other things that I might be considering for my garden, considering I don't have a whole lot of sunlight, would be this is a hosta, very, very popular. All right, you get beautiful broad leaves, you even get some nice purple blooms and things like that. You'll see them all over our area. They're another great plant that grows well, but the only caveat to those is that the deer really like those. So plants typically fall on a spectrum of deer resistance. Again, don't be afraid to stop by your local garden center to ask them which ones are going to be more resistant than others. One of my favorites over the past few years that I found to be very deer resistant is this one right here, and this is called an astilbe. Reason I like this, not only is it deer resistant, it grows well in shade, it's got these beautiful plumes of blooms, it's a really high performing plant. So a lot of people get discouraged because the deer are eating their gardens or they can't get to grow what they want to grow. But it probably just means you might need to try something else. Don't be afraid to be adaptable, don't be afraid to fail, experiment, try some things out. This is one that my mother would never have considered until the deer started eating her plants and she planted it in her garden. And now it's one of her favorite plants in her garden. The deer stay away from it, gets you great color. It's an awesome plant. But again, I attribute that to her being able to be flexible, adaptable, and willing to experiment. Now, I might be biased because I do have a background working with the garden center, but I think people sometimes get a little shy with their wallet when it comes to perennials, where I love cut flowers, and people will spend $20 on a cut bouquet to have in their kitchen for a week, but then they don't want to spend $15 for a perennial, which can really become a staple in your garden for decades to come. So don't be shy. Unfortunately, one of the ways you learn to grow things is by killing some things along the way. Don't be afraid to fail. Have fun with it, experiment, try out some different things. A couple of other things that I'll show you real quickly here are very popular one over the past few years are euchera. Considering they show you a lot of different textures and colors and things like that. Even without the blooms, you do get some blooms. Some other very blooming plants, you get echinaceas. They're a native pollinator. That's another thing you might want to consider when growing your perennials. What do I want to bring into my garden? If I want to keep pests out, maybe I also want to bring in hummingbirds and butterflies and things like that. Something like an echinacea or a coreopsis will do that for you. Again, if you have a dry area, you might want to try some succulents. These are, more almost like they have a thicker, waxy leaf. You'll get a lot of sedums and things like that that can grow in drier areas like that. So before I let you go, I'll give you one last final pro tip when shopping for perennials at the garden center. During spring, you're going to find the biggest selection. So if you really want a specific type of plant, go right in May or in early June. That's when your garden centers are going to have everything that you could possibly want to grow. If you're looking for a deal, try checking out a garden center in fall. A lot of times garden centers are trying to unload some material, so you'll find some great deals. Now the downside of that is that places are starting to run out of things, so if you really wanted a particular plant, you might not find it. But again, fall is my favorite time to plant. You're probably going to find some good deals, so that's really a savvy time to go check out some plants. So those are kind of my pro tips for you. Again, I hope you enjoyed the show today. Thanks for joining us. We had a lot of fun learning and growing together, and we'll see you next time.